Welcome, Jared Bessmer. This is our episode 2 of the Community Spotlight, spotlighting deaf and hard of hearing individuals throughout our state that are doing some pretty amazing things. So, Jared, before we start, can you just tell us a little bit about your experiences, career, kind of who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi there. My name is Jared Bessmer here. I'm 25 years old. So I was raised in Osman, Nebraska, so kind of in that northeast Nebraska region. I currently reside over in Plainview, so just 10 miles over to the west of where I grew up. Uh, a little backstory about me is that I was born profoundly deaf, bilaterally. I got my first cochlear implant when I was about approximately 18 months old, and then I got my left side done when I was, I think, like 12 or 13, somewhere in that time frame. So I do have bilateral cochlear implants. I kind of grew up going to a mainstream community school there in Osmond. Going to school, I was, the only deaf individual. I did have a sign language interpreter, which was, greatly appreciated. That made going to school a lot easier. And then I did also have some deaf educators that I worked very, very closely with going through school, as well as speech therapists as well. Kind of moving afterwards, high school transitioning into the college. I went to Northeast in Norfolk, and I majored in nursing there, and eventually went back and got my paramedic as well. So after college, I transitioned into working as a registered nurse in the intensive care unit at now Faith Health in Norfolk. And I've been working there for 4 years now. I'm still there kind of as a part-timer as needed. But here in the last 2 months, about 2 months ago, I transitioned into a new role as a flight nurse. And so I've been flying now kind of between both Kearney and Columbus, kind of just been floating between the two bases. And 2 months in, and I'm loving it.
That is an interesting story. Wonderful. Thank you. So, our first question, growing up as the only deaf and hard of hearing kid in your school, you talked about learning to advocate for yourself at a young age. How did you gain the confidence to advocate for yourself? And how is that confidence carried into your career today?
Yeah, absolutely. Looking back, I think it was just something that was a skill that I kind of acquired over time. I was, quickly instilled there, quickly realized that, I wasn't always going to have somebody to, be my buddy or to defend me, after high school and after college. I knew that, like, going through college, I was, going to work in a career where I was going to have to advocate for myself. If there's something that I need, I'm going to have to ask for it. Or if I, misunderstood something, it's just, getting that skill and that confidence to speak up and say, hey, can you repeat that? Or I misunderstood that. If it's something more major than that, just, simply making the time to come in after class or after school and, work with, the teachers one-on-one to kind of figure something out. And so I think that that's really as I transitioned over into the workforce, I think having those skills has made it a lot easier to go approach, my college instructors and um, work with them to make sure that they had some sort of the list of accommodations just to make things a little bit easier for me. And honestly, some of the accommodations might make things easier for the other students too. And there's that. And then also over in the workforce, I think it's been really awesome. I've worked with a lot of coworkers now, and I think it serves almost as an icebreaker that, like, hey, just so you know, here's like a little insight about my deafness. This is something special about me. Like, here's a tip or two that you can help me out, and this is just kind of something that communication is really important in our role, and so this is something that you can do to kind of help me facilitate this process and just to make the best of the worlds for both of us. And um, a lot of my partners and coworkers, they've all kind of have thought that that's really cool that they get to work with somebody who's deaf and that type of thing. And most, I want to say honestly, everybody has been really great with making those accommodations and being adaptive and that type of thing. And I have honestly have not had major issues up until today.
So, a follow-up question to that, when you were younger, was it always just very natural for you to self-advocate, or were there times where you struggled?
Oh, yeah. There were definitely times where I struggled, and there's honestly times today where I'm like, gosh, I don't really want to do this. Like, like I wish it was just, I wish they would just know. Like it was just it would be easier, to not have to have those crucial conversations. But it's just, I have to remember that I think that I have done so well with my speech and hearing that, people just don't realize. But yeah, and so I mean, with that being said, yes, I still struggled. I obviously definitely struggled when I was, in elementary and, kind of into junior high. That was a big change. So I did have the help of my sign language interpreter and my deaf educators. They kind of, I think they both really helped set me up for success. They kind of instilled like, this is you got to do this. It's kind of like this is kind of what you need to do. This is kind of what you need to say. Like, they kind of really established that for me, and kind of they were really good.
That's
So
nice.
more than just communication support, you felt like your sign language interpreters and your deaf educators played a major role in teaching you that advocacy as well.
For sure. Yes. Yes. I give them all the credit.
Great. So, do you feel the pressure to like fit in? You know, how it can maybe hold individuals back? What would you say to someone who is struggling with that?
Yeah, I kind of was, really stumped on this question. As that is something that I feel like I still even struggle with in today's world, where in the workforce that I work in, and, being the only deaf individual in school, I frequently found myself, trying to just, fit in, and just, I think it was more of a matter of the fact, like I just got to accept it as the way it is. And I just have to do my best to, develop friendships and relationships, and, rapport with my partners and coworkers and that type of thing. And I think that the big thing is you got to just be open. I think that's the best way to go about it, is just to be open, make sure that, those people that you're working with, or your instructors, teachers, just making sure that they at least acknowledge, you know, the deafness that you have, and like at least give them a tip or two to at least make communication a little bit easier for you. Whether that's just like, hey, can you just remember to face me when you're talking to me? Or like, can we get out of the wind or something like that? Or, just making sure that they're, accepting. But and I don't really have any advice to go beyond, if you are around people who aren't or not accepting, because I feel like I was very fortunate to go to the school that I did and to the college that I went to. I was honestly surrounded by a bunch of people, and, people that truly cared about the education that I was getting, and, how that I felt, and, inclusivity and that type of thing. So I apologize. I don't really have much of an answer for that one.
No, I think that's really great and telling, that it's not a one size fit all answer because experiences are so unique. And from a or perspective of organizations like Hands and Voices and the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, we see that struggle as well. We support these communities as well. And one of our solutions, which is not a one size fit all, as the same, is this interview format, is to, give kids with hearing differences tangible examples of careers, of futures, of lives that they may feel a pressure, or they may feel that urge to fit in currently. And people like you that we interview every day, sit here and tell us I got where I am by doing the exact opposite, by advocating for myself, by standing up. And as you started by with your welcome, I mean, you were an ICU charge nurse, you've worked in the ER, volunteer paramedic, and now your newest endeavor is flight nursing, which is incredible. I'm sensing a theme of some fast-paced thrill environments. Um, have you always been drawn to that path? Have you always been drawn to the thrill seeking?
Uh, I think so. Yeah, that is something that I love. I love adrenaline, adrenaline and stress. Uh, yeah, just looking back, like my father was a pretty big role model while I was going out through high school, and he was an active part of the ambulance squad in our small town, and so it was kind of became more of a love at first sight, just being around the ambulances, and I just quickly developed that passion for wanting to care for others, and specifically working in those emergent situations and dealing with people that are critically sick or injured and that type of thing. And I love studying medicine, and it's ever changing, and just being able to critically think and having to be quick on my feet. Uh, it's something that I've enjoyed.
That's fantastic. So, in your work as a nurse, you use specialized tools. You mentioned one to us, use a stethoscope that connects to your cochlear implants. Can you walk us through like the logistics of that, how that works, how that's changed what's possible for you in your job? Was there a time where you started without this technology and then you acquired it? Was there a difference?
So when I first started out, so like when I went through the EMT class when I was a senior in high school, uh, the technology was very new, and I actually had a different stethoscope than what I have now, and it was one that it was very obvious that I had something different, and so it drew a lot of attention to like, what's that? What's that? What are you doing? And that type of thing, because it was literally just like the bell of the stethoscope, and it would plug into what I had called a Roger pen, which is basically a microphone, and that microphone would Bluetooth to my cochlear implant.
Wow.
And so it was definitely not your typical stethoscope. And so that was like kind of where the advocacy, my confidence like really grew, and where I, really got used to being open to explaining like, yes, you're in the presence of somebody who has a disability. Like I can't hear, I can't use a regular stethoscope. So this is like a tool that's worked for me. Um, and then they came out with a newer stethoscope, which is the one that I have today. And it just looks like a regular stethoscope, except it's got a little part to it, which I had in here just to kind of show. But, and that's like logistically, basically, it just takes me approximately about, I would say 15, 20 seconds. I basically just have to open up my phone, connect it to connect the stethoscope to my phone, and then my phone connects to the cochlear implants. So I mean, there's just a slight delay compared to like somebody using a regular stethoscope, and it works amazing. As long as I have my phone and I have my stethoscope and everything's charged, and working, it works great. Uh, the process of like finding it basically was when I was in high school, when I was a senior. I quickly realized, in the medical field, you can't work in the medical field without a stethoscope. And so uh, at that time, I was working very closely with vocational rehabilitation, or VR. And at that time, I was working closely with one of their advisors. And so she was amazing. She worked to find like a grant that would kind of help pay for it, and she was the one that actually found the stethoscope for me at the time. And so she kind of handled behind the scenes work for me and was able to find the funding for it, and I basically got it for free. So that was really awesome. Outside of the stethoscope, we do a lot of two-way radio communications, especially in the pre-hospital atmosphere. And something that I was a pretty big advocate for was a page to a text. So every time we get a page, it also now comes across as a text message. And I think a lot of people, not only me, but a lot of people have found that super beneficial because it just prevents like, did I hear that correctly? Did I hear that correctly? And then it also serves as something to reference back to, like 5 minutes out, and you get to thinking like, well, what did dispatch say? And so then you can it serves as a reference to go back to. And so those are probably the biggest tools that I use in my practice that have helped make things a lot easier and that have served as accommodations.
That leads me directly into my next question. I feel like I've already heard it a couple times in this conversation. I heard it earlier. You said, my accommodations oftentimes also helped the people around me. What I advocated for at work is often used by everyone now because it's just more reliable to see it written in text. So here at the office and obviously around the community, we call that deaf gain, which is the idea that deaf perspectives and deaf lived experience lead to innovations that benefit all of society. In your work as a flight nurse and beyond, how has your perspective and your lived experience as a deaf individual shaped the way your team communicates, problem solves, delivers care? Basically, why does the healthcare field benefit from providers like you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the partners and the nurses and physicians that I have, worked with, it's kind of has brought them a whole new perspective of like, and kind of gives them an expectation or kind of like that they learn how to work or even like treat a patient that might have a similar disability as to what I do. And also working in the medical field, where things are like super critical. You're talking about like physician orders, you're talking about med doses, which involves a lot of numbers, protocols, all that type of thing. And so I have seen in the workforce now, a lot of that is all written or it's like all on our phones. A lot of people now go to like text messaging. So like working in the ICU, we can send a text message to the physicians or whoever that we need to communicate with. And I think it's made communication a lot more easier and less intimidating. You always hear about how nurses are always intimidated to call the doctor. it's easier to send a text message. So, who's not going to opt to go that route? And it's been awesome to work with physicians that are, willing to text and like I explained back before, having those orders and when it comes to talking about medications and that type of thing, it serves as a good reference or a tool to actually be able to read rather than just hear it, because then it's an easier way of double checking, making sure that I heard it right. When they send out the text message, it gives them a chance to see what they said, and that type of thing. And so I feel like text messaging is honestly like a safer alternative to doing over the phone communication, that type of thing. But like kind of getting back to like working with me, I think it allows like the nurses to kind of be more well-rounded, to treat patients that have a communication barrier. We take care of a lot of patients that are intubated and sedated, and so they can't even talk, or perhaps, patients that just speak a different language. And so it kind of allows, the people in the medical field to be, more well-rounded. And honestly, this question really made me think of a recent experience was that we had a patient who had a very extensive surgery. And so when they came out of surgery to ICU, we come to find out that this patient had cochlear implants, and this patient was obviously also deaf. And the nurses, they were struggling to communicate with this patient as this patient was waking up from surgery, and they were struggling to get the cochlear implants on. And so they were all struggling with that, but they all knew a guy that would know, so they all reached out to me, and I was that middleman, and I was able to help that patient out. I was able to take that minute to kind of teach my coworkers, like, this is what I deal with on a daily basis. And so I was kind of able to show them the parts of the cochlear implant and kind of, how the cochlear implant works and like how to turn it on and that cool stuff. And so that was probably one of my favorite shifts where I was, able to kind of talk about what I go through and how I communicate. And, I really took advantage of that time to show them tips and tricks and like, this is what I go through on the daily, and how can we make communication for this patient easy too, so that way they can understand, like all the the therapies instructions, the instructions that we have for caring for that patient in the post-op phase, and the discharge instructions, making those modifications to make sure that we know that the patient understands the information that they need to know before they go home. So.
Jared, I love that story.
Yes, thank you for sharing.
So that kind of leads into the next question. You use spoken English. You also have used a sign language interpreter. Do you sometimes feel like you're kind of navigating in between the deaf and hearing world?
Quite frequently. Yeah, I think that's what makes our world very unique and interesting. I think it's been a blessing to be able to communicate both ways, to be able to sign and then to also be able to hear with my cochlear implants and use spoken English. Not only for my own benefit, but kind of just going back to the story that I basically told, it allows me to share the perspective from for people who only use spoken English, to kind of share the stories and the perspective of what it's like to have deafness, and really share the awareness, spread awareness for people who have disabilities like me. Yeah.
Great. So you shared earlier that sometimes when you get home, you take your cochlear implants off, and that is very common, we know. Why is the quiet time important to you? And what do people usually misunderstand about that choice?
I'm honestly not even sure if a lot of people know that I do this. I know my parents know, because I would do it all the time when I was at home and just didn't want to listen to my parents. I would always take my cochlear implants off. But like, I honestly, here at home, I usually only do it when I'm home alone. Usually when my wife is home, I have it on and that type of thing. But obviously I don't sleep with it on either. But I I think like the biggest misconception, and like what I always try to spread awareness on, is that I honestly think that for most people, listening is kind of more of a passive action, meaning that like it just requires little to no effort. I think like most people are probably just it's normal to just naturally be able to hear things, and it comes relatively easy for people that don't have this disability compared for me. Whereas like for me, it's a very active process. Like if, when I'm trying to have a conversation with somebody, I'm like, my brain is like constantly like I'm trying to focus and trying to listen, like not only to like just focus on the conversation, but like to, I think it takes extra brain power for me to take the electrodes that the cochlear implant is, sending in, trying to decipher those different sounds, what those sounds are, and then also where are those sounds coming from. And so I think it takes a lot more brain power for me to be able to communicate via spoken English and using my cochlear implants. And so when I'm at home and home alone, just taking the cochlear implants off just really gives me an easy way to just decompress and not have to use that sense. And I think it just gives my brain a chance to relax. And so that's that's primarily ideally why I do it.
If I'm sorry, Shelley, if I'm correct, that's listening fatigue, right? That would be what we call that. Right. I just feel that that must be exacerbated in your job.
It it is, especially since I'm like new to flight nursing and still kind of figuring the routine and everything out. Um flying in a helicopter, is an entirely new world for me. And so you're talking about all the different sounds, you're talking about the vibrations, uh, and I'm also, you're talking a whole new environment, being going from a hospital where you have multiple nurses, respiratory therapists, you got the physicians, to now a helicopter, you got different sounds, vibrations, you're taking care of this patient with just you and your partner. um, and the shifts are 24 to 48 hours, and so I'm also having to wear my cochlear implant for the whole 24 or 48 hours, even while I'm sleeping, because pages will come in the middle of the night, and so I do leave my cochlear implant on so that way I can hear those pages when they come across. And so I have found that after my shifts, I am extremely fatigued, and so yeah, it's but I always take that day after my shift. Here lately, it's just been it's a day that I set aside to basically just relax before my next shift. Yeah.
So I had the same question as Kendall. So when you're experiencing listening fatigue at work, what are some things that you can do to help combat that?
So we yeah. In the 2 months that I have learned, or in the 2 months that I have been flying, I have learned how much we idolize crew safety and rest and that type of thing. And so utilizing crew resource management. And so, as I am starting new to this role, I have been doing like a lot of education and simulations and that type of thing. And so this kind of just goes back to being open with my partner and just saying like, hey, I know it's mid shifter, but I just need a break. I just need to go take some time, just go to my quarters and just kind of lay down for a little bit, maybe even take a little nap, and just being open with them, just sharing with them like what I'm doing, what my plan is, and like just letting them know that like, hey, if there's something that comes in or if you need me, like just you know give me a ring, come wake me up, that type of thing. And so yeah, rest is probably the best way to go about it, and just being open and advocating for my needs, like I that type of thing.
So your family is hearing,
Correct.
but they've committed to learning ASL.
Yeah, my parents and my siblings, when I was first diagnosed with deafness, we actually had a deaf educator that came into our home, like I want to say like before I even started preschool, that type of thing. Honestly, I think it was probably a matter of fact, like when my parents first learned that I was had a hearing loss. And that deaf educator basically worked very closely with my parents and siblings, like taught them sign language, kind of taught them like how to navigate, go about having a child that has hearing loss. And I still continue to give her a lot of credit, and I just don't know what I would do if it wasn't for her, because she just did a lot of things. And and so my parents, they still do know some sign language. It's obviously not the primary way that we communicate, but they do know the basic signs. And then when I met my wife, her family thought it was so cool that I knew sign language. And my wife's like siblings, they've even taken it upon themselves to learn sign language. Like they've watched lots of YouTube videos, or they'll watch like reels, sign language, and so they've like learned the alphabet. They've like learned multiple signs, and my wife has also done the same thing. She's every now and then she's learning pieces of new signs, and she knows the alphabet, and so if it really comes down to it, I honestly think I feel comfortable knowing that there's a way that we'll be able to communicate. Um, and it's been a lot of fun, being able to teach them signs, and then when we hang out, they'll just start signing, random things. They're like, "Hey, what's the sign for this?" And so it's been cool.
That's nice to hear.
We like to close out our interviews with roughly the same question. As you know, our goal here is to give kiddos with hearing differences just all the resources and examples that they could have to show them that nothing's stopping them. So, what do you want deaf-blind, hard of hearing kids and their families to understand about what's possible for their futures?
Yeah. Um, it's unfortunate that there's not a universal way of communicating for a way that works best for everybody. But I think the big thing is just, continuing to just build that confidence, just to advocate and spread awareness of the deaf culture. And there's a high chance that, as I continue to spread that awareness, there's people that are around me in my, everyday life that they may acquire deafness, in the aging population. It's something that we commonly deal with. And so if they practice, implementing those tools or resources, such as like closed captioning on a TV or, a form of more written communication, I'd like to think that's only going to make things easier for them. Perhaps they do acquire hearing loss in their older age, that type of thing. And I honestly just think of, sign language as just another language. And so with that being said, I just think of it, there's always going to be that, barrier. There's, people that speak Spanish, there's people that speak English, and then there's also people that do ASL. It's just, a preferred, language. And it's just, just at least trying to be able to be aware and how to go about it to kind of help facilitate communication. Like, I'm not saying like everybody needs to know sign language. I just want at least everybody to know that there are translators out there. Like in the hospital, we have Spanish translators, but we also, on the system that we use, there's also a translation system for people that will do sign. And so just, at least making people aware of those, advanced technology and tools and stuff like that. And with that, with the new technology that keeps coming out every day, I think the sky is becoming the new limit. Unfortunately, there are still some careers or jobs out there that being able to use, spoken English is kind of an essential. It's something that's needed to do the job. But if you're willing to adapt and overcome those obstacles, there's a great chance that the people that you'll be working with are also going to do the same back to you. They're going to do the best that they can do to accommodate and help you out where you can. And at least in my experiences, that's what I've seen. So just, spreading the deaf awareness, like saying, like, just being open, like this is this is what my daily life looks like. Just here's a few pointers to kind of help you out. And like I said in the beginning, people have been really great about, taking the accommodations and, implementing them, and they're wanting to see me be successful as well. And, and in the flight line, there's myself and a partner, and then as well as the pilot. And so like, they want to make sure that I know the information just as well as they do, so that way I can be an essential part of the team and be as much help as I can. You just gotta continue to just. I'm saying this, you just have to continue to advocate, because over time people do forget. Like I said earlier, I think people just kind of get into the routine that, yeah, I can almost just hear as well as you can, but truly, I have to work a lot harder to just hear as well as you can. And I think it becomes a routine. So sometimes you have to, remind people, which it does get annoying after a while, but if I want to be successful, it's what I have to do.
Thank you for sharing that. I think hearing that is especially important. I think me and Shelley working for organizations who directly support these communities, we hear that a lot. The frustration of being the advocate of all the time. Why do I have to educate everyone? Why don't people just know and they know how to approach me? And obviously that is a future we're all striving towards. For there to be not such a glaring gap between the worlds that we talked about that you traverse, hearing and deaf, for there to be more shared understanding. Because I imagine just like listening fatigue, there's a fatigue that comes with feeling like you constantly have to educate the rest of the world on basic needs. But for someone who is so confident in doing so, I think the fact that you're doing it in the healthcare space and, educating your coworkers on empathy standards when it comes to, caring for people with hearing disabilities or whatever that looks like, is a step in the right direction and fantastic work. And we thank you so much for sharing your story here today.
Absolutely. Yeah, I almost feel like I'm getting to the point where I'm just repeating myself, but like you can ask my wife. There's multiple times where we have conversations where I am just upset that the world just doesn't bow down to me. Like why is this so hard? Like why why am I struggling so bad with like communication? Like why can't it just be easier for me? Just why? And all these questions and the advice that I'm giving is just simply the advice that my wife has given me to kind of help, navigate this, saying, because she's also hearing too. And so she kind of just reminds me of the perspective of what it looks like from her end. How did it look like when we met? And like, how well did it appear that I could do communication? And that the mainstream community just doesn't quite acknowledge how severe my disability is and how well it impacts communication. And so that's just where I come in with you just got to spread the deaf awareness, and you just have to build the confidence and to advocate and share like what works well for you and that type of thing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jared. We really appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. My pleasure.